Nick and Nate Diaz are two of the most revered and respected fighters in the UFC. But here's the catch-22. They're not stepping into the Octagon. They want a big payday. If you looked at Nate Diaz, he only accepted the Conor McGregor fight. That was the only fight that he wanted. Whereas Nick also wanted a big money fight. He was campaigning for a rematch against George St. Pierre, GSP, one of the best welterweights to ever grace the sport. And he was also campaigning for possibly a championship fight with Tyrone Woodley. But when push came to shove, he didn't sign the contract. And does this tell us something about, are they true fighters or not? Of course not. It's easy to look at the contract and say if their signature is not on the paper, they're not willing to fight. Well, that's incorrect. These two fighters always step up their game. Nate stepped up on 10 days' notice against Conor McGregor, and he won that via submission, lost the rematch though. And Nick Diaz, previously, years ago, in Strikeforce in particular, was fighting 4 or 5 times a year. So you can't say these guys are not fighters because they 100% are. But what is going to make them get back into the Octagon? Because it's a brutal game. And with their styles, they're smart about it. They understand that you need to dish out more punishment than you can get. I mean, it's the sweet science of boxing. I mean, that's what they replicate. And, you have to hit before you can get hit. It's that kind of philosophy. And Nick and Nate Diaz personify that. So they need to pick their fight styles wisely. Nate Diaz is ranked inside the top 10 of the lightweight division. Can he make the lightweight weight? He can. It's 155 pounds, which is about 70 pounds 70 kilograms. But, he's a big 70 kilo guy. He really should be fighting in the welterweight division. And you're seeing fighters moving up a weight class now because there's no IV anymore. So an IV is a hydration tool which you can use to rehydrate yourself. Similar to if you've ever had a surgery in hospital, sometimes they give you, or a lot of the time they will give you, IVs. UFC fighters after a tough weight cut used to just receive IVs. And it was not necessarily there for performance enhancement. It was just to, rehydrate themselves for the fight, because some fighters can drop a huge amount of weight to get a reach advantage over another opponent. I mean, it's not unusual to see 5'11" guys in the lightweight division. Vic stands out. Tony Alkakui Ferguson, who's versing Khabib Nurmagomedov soon. So these are all stumbling blocks in which the Diaz brothers face. George St. Pierre wants more money, but he's not getting it. So he's in a stalemate with the UFC. So what's going to happen in the future? This is all part of the negotiation tactics which the UFC is employing at the moment. Dana White is the custodian of that. You can't really teach how to fight promote. You either have it or you don't. And Dana White has it. Dana White built the empire. That is the Ultimate Fighting Championship. It really started from nothing in 1993. And now it's really grown into this massive pay-per-view show where there are multiple shows held across different countries. Australia has been a benefactor of that. And George St. Pierre wanted to appear in his hometown of Canada before the end of last year, but he didn't get it. And it was a money issue, primarily. So if George St. Pierre were to compete again, would he verse Michael Bisping for the middleweight title, or would he go up to welterweight? I mean, this is a very interesting situation here. George St. Pierre is a great fighter, no doubt, but can he withstand the rigors of the middleweight division? There's a giant leap from, well, any division really, but especially from the welterweight division, which he is considered one of the greatest of, if not the greatest welterweight to ever compete in the UFC, to middleweight. Because in middleweight, you have contenders of the like of Luke Rockhold, Chris Weidman, Yoel Romero, Jacare Souza. I mean, all four of these guys are killers, and they're specialists in their own right. Jacare Souza beat Tim Bosic at UFC 208 with a Kimura. So very deadly on the ground. Could George St. Pierre withstand the ground game of Souza? Don't think so. He's a very good jiu-jitsu practitioner, Jacare Souza is. But George St. Pierre is very athletic. And athleticism goes a long way in any sport, really. You look at Brock Lesnar, who trialed out the WWE, and not only did he try out the WWE and the UFC, he also trialed out the NFL. He trialed out wrestling by itself. He was an outstanding college wrestler. And this is not about George St. Pierre's drawing ability or fighting ability. It's about the UFC getting the most from it. So there's a slice of the pie and the UFC want more, but George St. Pierre is willing, but he wants a bit more money than he's getting currently. Because under the Reebok deal, this limits UFC fighters in the sponsors they can have, within the Octagon. You can only have Reebok as the sole clothing company. So, GSP, he's getting a lot of money even though he's not fighting. Will the will to fight get him back? Or will he say, I've already had a great career and enough is enough? Time will tell. And you're listening to Above the Octagon on SYN 90.7. Of course, it's the third show, and it's time for a regular segment. It's called Remember That Fight. So as you may remember in the first and second shows, I've analysed Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz, and I've also analysed Michael Bisping and Anderson Silva. Both of those fights went the 5 rounds, and both of those fights had a decision, had to come to a decision because neither opponent finished off their other person. So the one I'm going to analyse today is not actually a pay-per-view event. So this was a co-main event with Michelle Waterson and Paige Van Zandt, where Waterson was the victor over Paige Van Zandt. Paige Van Zandt is seen as one of the brighter prospects in women's MMA, and Waterson in her own right is that as well, but Paige Van Zandt is considered to be very bright. Even though she lost, she'll gain a lot of experience from it. The fight I'm going to analyse is between Sage Super Northcutt, Super is the nickname for him, and Mickey Gall. So this was a battle of the young guns, and mark my words, these two will be headlining pay-per-view events for a decade plus, easy. Because in UFC terms, so they're in their young 20s, another decade, and you're in your young 30s. If you look at it, Anderson Silva, considered to be one of the greatest of all time, he didn't hit his peak until he was about in his early 30s till his late 30s. So a lot can happen in the space of 2 years, 3 years, and I suspect it to be the case with these two. So the overwhelming thing here is that Mickey Gall won. So Mickey Gall is a highly competent jiu-jitsu fighter who has very good transitions and very nasty rear naked chokes. Not a lot of his opponents want to get submitted by that. CM Punk found that out when he transferred from the WWE to have a go at the UFC. I mean, these guys, despite their young age, they're just great practitioners in their own right. I mean, Sage has a very disciplined diet. If you look at him when he was below 10 years of age, he looks absolutely ripped. his abs, his muscles. So he's been working out since he was a baby, since he was a kid. And Mickey Gall has been training jiu-jitsu before he was 20 years old, a lot earlier than that. So Mickey is a specialist, whereas Sage Northcutt has a very good karate-based background, probably an exceptional one at that. But he's not quite experienced when it comes to the world of mixed martial arts. He still has a little bit to go. And I think he's actually out of his uni course now, so he can focus full-time on fighting. And these are the hard decisions that you have to make sometimes to be successful, because not everyone can do both uni and UFC. Sometimes it has to be a sole focus on where you want to go. I mean, visualization is a huge thing in fighting and in sports in general, where you visualize where you want to go, you see how the fight is playing out. And so when you get into the octagon to fight, it's not as much a surprise as it could be. And I think this is where Northcutt needs to take his next level in terms of his fight game, because he has the physical strength. I mean, you just Google him on Google Images. You'll see how strong he is, how disciplined he is. And, there's a lot of talk about steroids, but you can't say that because he's been tested so many times by USADA. So they're one of the top anti-doping governing bodies, not just in America, but, in the world, period. So Sage Northcutt is steroid free, and he looks like that. And imagine when he gets his experience up in mixed martial arts, he could be an absolute monster. Clearly he's got the striking game, but in Mickey Gall found him out on the ground. He dropped Sage with a right hand punch, but Mickey Gall was also wobbled a little bit by Sage in the second round. But in general, when it was on the ground, Sage was no match Mickey Gall had a leg over Sage or two, because he was just so smooth on the ground. And one thing that will help both of these fighters is that although they both possess good athleticism, particularly Sage, they're both marketable. I mean, Gall is very charismatic, whereas Sage is very humble, and he's also got that charisma about him as well. So, especially with a name such as Sage Northcutt, I mean, you think of a wizard, a sage, and Mickey Gall, in a similar vein. I mean, both of them have great names, and you may laugh at that, but, sometimes with names, it's an important thing, especially when commentators are commentating a fight. If it's a hard surname to pronounce, it can sometimes ruin the flow of the commentary. For instance, there's a fighter called Habib Nurmagomedov. Now, some people don't know how to pronounce Nurmagomedov, and they say Nurmagomedov. It's like, a bit weird, whereas these fighters are just simple. Mickey Gall and Sage Northcutt. So they're names that will be on the forefront of people's minds, and not only because they're simple, but they're good fighters and they have great personalities and a bright future in the UFC. Hope you have been enjoying the show so far, and this is a controversial fight, the one I'm going to speak about. Derek Brunson versus Anderson Silva, which was played only a few days ago. And Derek Brunson has every right to be angry at the decision lost. It was not a majority decision where one judge supported him and two judges went against him. All three judges went against Derek Brunson. So why was this the case? Well, I was looking at the fight myself as a fan, and as much as I love Anderson Silva, I thought Derek Brunson won that fight. Look at the statistics. He has double the amount of strikes that Anderson had, and he had, a few takedowns, but to Anderson Silva's credit, and this may have influenced, or this would have influenced the judges' scoring, he was very good at stuffing the takedowns. So by stuffing the takedowns, I mean negating the takedown itself and sprawling with Derek Brunson. One thing Anderson Silva has always had throughout his career is that element of danger. Even when he's not doing anything, his inactivity threatens the patience of the other fighter because they go, what do I do? What do I do? And sometimes Anderson does a couple of weird things where which other fighters don't do. For instance, when he goes into his, southpaw stance, sometimes he can just stay still or he can just put his hands down. And one thing you're taught in mixed martial arts and boxing as a discipline in mixed martial arts is always to keep your hands up. But Anderson Silva doesn't do that as much as he should, and he's been caught with some punches. I can name Chris Weidman, I can name Michael Bisping, I can name quite a few, even though he's been so successful. He's had 14 title defenses. He's got his weaknesses, but as much as he's got his weaknesses and vulnerabilities, he's got his absolute strengths, which is his striking ability and his inactivity, because his inactivity scares opponents, because when he's active, he's so active, he's on the attack, which was what was happening in the Brunson fight. But then he would also stall the fight where he just wouldn't do anything and he'd just be defending. So sometimes the opponent says, well, what's going on here? And Derek Brunson, came out on social media and said, I haven't got a bonus from Dana White, the boss, for winning that fight, because he, for all intents and purposes, thought he won that fight, and I agree with him. Even Dana White supported that statement. But one thing Dana said, which is true, which is the unfortunate truth, is that if you don't want it to go to the judge's decision, you have to finish the fight. And even though Anderson Silva got caught with some shots, it never looked particularly bad. You wouldn't say it was a robbery victory. One can see how the outcome could go to Silva but the fact that all three judges, in particular one judge scored the fight 30-27. So that means Anderson Silva won all 3 rounds, which, watch the third round. Did Anderson Silva win that? No. Derek Brunson was very attacking, very dominant. He had good octagon control. He, although not exerting a lot of damage, he did a little bit, whereas Anderson Silva was inactive. But even though his inactivity helped him in the first and second rounds, it was Derek Brunson kind of figured him out in the third, and his coach kind of just said, "You're respecting him too much, Derek. Focus, and you're faster, stronger." And after the Octagon, after the match, Anderson Silva said, "I understand I'm too old to fight." He said in his Brazilian language, broken English, "I'm too old for fight, but I want to still compete for my heart." And basically he's saying there that he wants to keep competing even though he knows he's past his prime. And it's hard for fighters to say no sometimes. But Anderson Silva, by no stretch of the imagination, is done. I mean, he beat, whether he did beat him or not, I don't think it was a close fight. I think Brunson beat him, quite convincingly. But Anderson Silva definitely had his moments where you saw that the old Anderson was back. But they were few and far between. It wasn't frequent. It lasted maybe like 20 seconds per round, whereas Derek Brunson had control for everything, basically. So he always threatened in this fight, Anderson Silva did, but he looked to be going at a slow pace. And age waits for no man. No matter how athletic you are, no matter how good you are, no matter how skilled you are, no matter how talented you are, age tells. And it particularly tells in the Octagon. And Anderson Silva was frank about that, frank and honest, open in the Octagon after the fight. But he's still competing, and as long as he enjoys it, which he is, that's the main thing. And as much as it was nice to see Anderson Silva win, I think Derek can take a lot out of that and say, even though in the history books it will go down as a loss to Derek Brunson, true fight fans will realise who actually won that fight. You're listening to SYN 90.7 Above the Octagon with myself, Jonathan Pertile, and I thank you for tuning in to the show thus far. And we've still got a bit to go, still some important matches to talk about. We're going to be talking about Holly Holm and Jermaine Durandamy, which was another controversial decision. And Jermaine Durandamy won, and I'm going to be talking about that in the next segment. But for now, I'm going to be talking about the fight previous to that, or two fights previous to that, and that was between Jacare Souza and Tim Bosic. So Jacare Souza was actually meant to fight in Melbourne. He was meant to fight in Melbourne against Luke Rockhold, but Luke Rockhold got injured. And so Jacare Souza was left in a position where he had to fight against a lesser ranked opponent because all the other fighters are either booked out or they're injured, or, take someone outside of the top 10. He took someone outside the top 10 in Tim Bosic, and Jacare Souza beat Tim Bosic. I don't think that was a surprise, but when you're entering into a match between Jacare and Tim Bosic, which has that element of, if I lose, I've lost everything, whereas Tim Bosic is coming in saying, if I win everything because I've just beaten a top 3 ranked contender in the middleweight rankings and I'm number 13. So sometimes you can get trapped in this mentality where it's, almost the Goliath scenario where you're versing this guy right up there who's extremely tall in the rankings, and it's either an opportunity or it's not, and it doesn't really matter. And Tim Bosic, he's not going to lose any fans or supporters by fighting Jacare Souza, or indeed losing to him, which was the case. But he'll gain fans that he took up the challenge, and Jacare accepted it. But this wasn't an easy fight for Jacare Souza. I mean, Tim Bosic possesses really good boxing power, good uppercuts, a good right hand. He has a good stance, Tim Bosic does, which generates a lot of power from his back foot, particularly on his right hand. And Jacare Souza is just really athletically gifted, even though he's in his late 30s. I was talking about before the show how fighters can kind of get a new lease of life in their 30s. And, Jacare doesn't look better than he has. I mean, he looks amazing. He has to verse a real contender. He has versed real contenders over his career and stood up well, whether that was a loss or a win. But he has to verse a contender in the top 5, like a Luke Rockhold, which is the fight I would advocate for, which is the fight they made in Melbourne, but what didn't happen, that should happen in the future, which would be a rematch. Luke Rockhold actually beat Jacare Souza in Strikeforce, and it went 5 rounds to a decision. And it was very close, so Jacare Souza definitely had his moments on the ground, standing up. His right hand's always deadly. So even though Jacare has this, scary jiu-jitsu ability, both on the ground and when standing up, particularly, not standing up, when on the top, he possesses great boxing power. And so he's very powerful, very explosive. And you saw that when he beat another explosive fighter in Brazil, Vitor Belfort. And he lost a close decision to Yoel Romero. Some people thought Jacare won that fight against Yoel Romero. Yoel Romero could possibly be fighting the middleweight champion, Michael Bisping. So we've just got to wait and see on how this all plays out. So Jacare was quite convincing in his fight against Tim Bosic. I mean, Tim, for all his courage in taking the fight, just could not match the skill level that Jacare had. And Jacare beat him via a Kimura submission. And sometimes with Kimuras, it's to do with the arm, so bending your arm on the ground, and it sounds nasty, and it certainly is. In this instance, though, fighters can kind of know when to stop a Kimura. So when someone is initiating a Kimura, what can happen if you go extremely hard at the arm is that it can snap. But Jacare didn't do that, and Tim Bosic tapped and Jacare let go. You've seen in other fights, Nogueira and Mir is a prime example where Frank Mir, considered to be one of the best, or probably I'd say, in my opinion, the best jiu-jitsu fighter in heavyweight history, he broke Nogueira's arm. He broke it through a Kimura. So fighters can know sometimes when, the other fighter's in a lot of distress in the submission, hope that they tap. But you have some fighters, though, who don't want to tap, and they're so tough that they'd rather lose oxygen, lose consciousness, and go out than... I'm talking about chokeholds rather than Kimuras here, but they'd rather be choked out than tap. And this has happened. And sometimes, in a Kimura sense, so it takes a broken arm for someone to tap. But if you have a broken arm, you have to go through surgery, you have to go through recovery. So fighters, and this is why mixed martial arts is more a sport than it is a fight. There's a lot of sportsmanship which is involved. Even if the other fighter hates the other fighter, you often see after the fight a lot of respect, or during the fight if there's a submission, ensuring that they let go once an opponent taps. Sometimes that doesn't happen, but if that doesn't happen, you're going to get disqualified, or you're going to get a point or two taken off you. It's pretty simple. And as a matter of fact, the next segment we're going to be talking about, which was between Holly Holm and Jermaine de Randamie. Jermaine de Randamie won the first ever featherweight title. Congratulations to Jermaine. But Holly Holm was hit after the bell, not once, but 2 times. Did she have the points taken off her? No. So this was a bit of inexperience by the referee, which possibly cost Holly Holm the title.